In the 17th century, European countries scrambled and partitioned Africa, and this continued until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, by which most of the land and also the resources in Africa had been completely divided and also colonized by European countries. The only two countries that were not colonized in Africa were Ethiopia and Liberia. There was a struggle for independence that started after World War II, and it was really torturous. I'm talking about assassinations and bloody fights and also revolts. That was like the order of the day. This struggle led to freedom. So Africa saw the independence of the Union of South Africa, that is in 1931, and later on the end of the apartheid, which is like a system of racial segregation that existed in South Africa and West Africa. That is from 1948 to 1994. Now, the end of this system saw the formation of a democratic government in South Africa. So Libya followed suit, that is in 1951, it gained independence from Italy. We also have South Sudan, that is in 1956. Those were just but among the first few countries to be free from colonization. We also have the last lot, which is inclusive of Seychelles, that is in 1976. We have Zimbabwe in 1980, we have Namibia in 1990, and also Eritrea in 1993. Almost 60 years after independence, and Africa is still considered among the poorest countries in the world. But why is this so? When it comes to natural resources, Africa is rich because it accounts for more than 30% of the world's mineral resources, and I'm talking about gold, diamonds, I'm talking about oil, and also gemstone, just to mention a few. Now, all these mineral resources, yet majority of its population is still living below the poverty line, earning less than $2 in a day. For the longest time, Africa's fixation has been on colonialism being the reason as to why the continent is existing in poverty. But there are many factors that contribute to the economic prosperity as well as the failure of a nation. So what has really contributed to the destitute state of Africa? So first up, we have a country like Singapore. Now, for those who did not know, Singapore is among the richest countries in the world and with the best economy, even better than its colonizers, Britain and Japan. Now, while Britain's per capita income is at $49,420, Japan's is at $44,570, and Singapore's is at $102,450. So per capita income in simple language is just basically individual income. If we divide the figures I've stated by 12 months, because those are annual figures, it means that the monthly income of an individual in Britain is estimated to be at around $4,118. That of an individual in Japan is estimated to be at $3,714, while that of an individual in Singapore is actually estimated to be at around $8,538. That is almost double of Britain and Japan. For over 100 years, Singapore was under the British control. But during the Second World War, it was conquered and occupied by the Japanese. That is from 1942 to 1945. And after this, Japan surrendered to the British. That is in 1945. And this was followed by Singapore merging with the Federation of Malaya, that is to form Malaysia. Because of disputes between the ruling parties of the two countries, that is Singapore and Malaysia, Singapore was actually kicked out of Malaysia, and after that it became an independent republic. That is in 1965. Now, if you did not know that Singapore was once part of Malaysia, now you know. So now, post-independence and split from Malaysia, Singapore was still experiencing problems like unemployment. Singapore had little natural resources, sanitation was an issue, they lacked proper infrastructure, and also they lacked adequate water supply. Now, in order to attract investors, Singapore had to create a conducive environment, a safe environment, and a corruption-free environment with also favorable taxation. It also had an advantage because it had an established port system, and this made it easier to actually manufacture goods. Just 7 years after independence, and Singapore was blooming. Now, as foreign investment money poured in, Singapore began focusing on developing its human resources. And with this, it actually set up schools and trained its unskilled workers in IT and electronics, and also enrolled the rest of the people in sectors such as tourism and transportation. By the 1970s, Singapore was exporting textiles, garments, and basic electronics, and by the 1900s, they're actually engaging in logistics, pharmaceuticals, we have aerospace engineering, just to mention a few. The port of Singapore is actually the second busiest port in the world. That is after Shanghai, that is a port in China. The tourism industry in Singapore is also flourishing. It also has like advanced medical technology. And as of now, Singapore is able to produce like a GDP of over 300 billion, that is annually. And the median annual individual income is at $56,160, which translates to around $4,680, that is per month per individual. Singapore now stands as an example of a state which has successfully developed in a manner that no one could actually have predicted 40 or 50 years ago, which is actually a considerably faster rate than any of like the other third world countries or the third world proceedings. Now, comparing a country like Singapore, which had little natural resources, had Japan and Britain battle for it, got merged with Malaysia, then got kicked out of Malaysia, to a country like Ethiopia and Liberia, which were not colonized, the difference is actually quite alarming, because these two African nations, that is Ethiopia and Liberia, are considered just as poor or even like poorer than those countries that were actually colonized. Now, Ethiopia is actually the most populous country in Africa, that is after Nigeria. It is rich in coffee, we have cat, we have gold, leather products, and oilseed. And the country also has like minerals ranging from gold, silver, tantalum, we have gemstone and marble. And all this, yet the country's economic state is worrying. Now, we cannot go without commending Ethiopia being ranked among the fastest growing economies, that is with a 6.3% growth in the financial year 2020-2021. It, however, still is among the poorest countries in Africa with a per capita income of $960. And this is according to like a recent Ethiopia World Bank report. And this means that individuals in Ethiopia actually make an average of $80 in a month. Now, for a fact, Liberia is a rich country. It is very rich when it comes to like minerals such as iron ore, we have gold and diamond. And the country also has like water with 6 major rivers flowing through it. Liberia was not colonized, and it is actually ranked among the poorest countries in Africa and in the world, with its per capita income being around $583, which means that the average monthly income for an individual living in Liberia is estimated at $48. Now, with these 3 examples, that is Singapore, Ethiopia, and Liberia, we can completely like trash out the notion that colonialism is actually the reason for poverty and the stagnant growth in Africa. Now, according to the World Bank, the poverty rate in Africa has really gone down, but there's also like a notable increase in the number of people actually living in poverty. So why is the world's richest continent also dubbed the world's poorest continent, despite being decades free from colonialism? So we can just like take a look at a few of the countries in Africa. Did you know that Nigeria is ranked among the biggest oil producers in the world, and its oil industry is worth over $40 billion? Nigeria is like literally mentioned in the same rank as the United States and Russia and Canada, just to mention like a few of the giants in the oil production industry that is globally. But why are these other countries flourishing and not Nigeria? Now, when we take a look at a country like Nigeria, it was under the British Empire, that is from the mid-19th century up to 1960. That is when it actually got its independence. And more than 60 years after independence, and Nigeria is still languishing in poverty to an extent that smaller countries such as Rwanda and Ivory Coast are actually catching up fast. Nigeria is rich in mineral resources. We have limestone, we have coal, we have gold, we have zinc and iron ore, just to mention a few. And it also happens to like be the world's biggest exporter of oil, as I stated earlier on. Now, Nigeria is also the second most populous country in Africa, that is after Ethiopia. With all this wealth, the country should have attracted like massive global investment, and by now should have been honestly among Africa's economic giants, but that is not the case. Now, it is said that big corporations from wealthier nations and also like most industrialized countries in Europe and South Asia actually find Nigeria's business climate unfavorable, and this is mainly because of corruption. We have insecurity and also like poorly maintained infrastructure. In a 2018 report, it was actually noted that the population growth rate in Nigeria was higher than the economic growth rate. That's contributing to like poverty, and that half of the population in Nigeria is actually living below the international poverty line of $2 a day, and that the unemployment rate is actually at 23.1%. Also in 2019, the economic growth rate of Nigeria was actually averaging at 7.4%. Poverty in Nigeria was and is mostly attributed to income inequality. We have conflict, we have misappropriation of resources, as well as political instability. Now, by 2021, Nigeria's per capita income stood at $2,085, which means that the monthly individual income was estimated at around $174. Not bad, but we cannot assume that every individual is actually making that $174 a month, because again, it is said that half of the population is actually poor. Nigeria, just like many other African nations, had the opportunity to actually blossom into a superpower, that is with the human and also like the material resources at its disposal. But a lack of commitment on the part of leadership has actually continued to rob the nation of its potential. Now, according to one article, Nigeria's oil alone is worth multi-billion dollars in revenue, but the money has always been misappropriated or embezzled or stolen, and it is not the colonial masters who are actually embezzling it, is it? Now, the nation is underdeveloping itself, and if only the leaders would take responsibility, then Nigeria would have been mentioned among or in the same rank as the United States by now. But since independence, the leaders have been draining the economy for their own interests, actually leaving the people poor. So what is ailing Nigeria is its leadership and not the colonial masters. Now, we also have a nation like Kenya. So did you know that by 2020, Kenya was actually ranked to have the third largest economy, that is in sub-Saharan Africa, coming behind Nigeria and South Africa. Now, it is still at the same time ranked among the poorest country in the world. Kenya was free from colonial power, that is in 1963, after being under the British colony or the British rule from 1920. But still, 50 years after its freedom, it has a long way to go, that is in terms of developing its economy. While Kenya is the home of minerals such as soda ash, and aside from that, it is known for its export of tea, coffee, vegetables, and flowers, but 42% of its population actually lives in poverty. This is because 75% of the population actually relies on agriculture to make a living, yet the climate is unreliable. It is also hard to like secure a job outside agriculture, especially for like poor families, and this is because of lack of education. Now, the per capita income of Kenya as of 2021 was estimated at $2,007, which means that individual income is actually estimated at $167. But how many people really see these figures? Now, we, however, cannot like go without commending the small growth that has been seen. So from 2015 to 2019, Kenya's economy has actually seen some growth that is averaging to 4.8% per year. And this has reduced the poverty, which fell at 34.4% at the $2 per day line in 2019. Kenya was also ranked among the richest countries in Africa, that is according to the World Population Review. However, just like Nigeria, its key development challenges still include poverty, we have inequality, unemployment of the youth, we have transparency and accountability, we also have the climate change and a continued weak private sector. Now, corruption, bribery, fraud, and tribal favorism in government also happen to be one of like the leading causes of poverty in Kenya, because they hinder like the attempts to like reform the country and also positive change. Though the biggest agenda to revive Kenya's economy has been the war against corruption, the results are yet to be seen. And with that, whatever is ailing the economy is actually far from colonialism. Now we can also take a look at a country like South Africa. So did you know that South Africa's mining industry is actually worth billions of dollars, and it's also considered like the world's largest producer of platinum, with nearly 90% of all the platinum metals on earth, that is followed by Russia. Now, South Africa also happens to be among the world's biggest producers of gold. And aside from that, South Africa is also considered among the richest nations in Africa, though most of the richest fall on the private wealth. So why again is South Africa termed poor despite all these ranks? Now, for a country like South Africa, freedom came twice. The first was the independence in 1931, that is followed by the end of apartheid, that is the racial segregation, in 1994. 28 years after South Africa was actually free from the apartheid system that actually trapped majority of the South Africans in poverty, most of the nation's wealth still remains in the hands of the elite. That is to date, meaning that there is a very big gap between the haves and the have-nots. Now, there's also a lot of disparity in terms of education as well as income, because more than half of the population are actually languishing in poverty. On the other hand, South Africa is Africa's most industrialized country, with an economy worth millions of dollars. Now, its annual GDP, that is the country's total income, as per 2022 was at $419.95 billion, whereas the per capita income was estimated at $6,994, meaning the monthly estimated individual income is around $699. But this rich status means nothing to the poor that are starving, or those who are toiling, while the few rich people actually own 70% of the country's wealth. Now, the cost of basic services such as housing, water, electricity has actually increased due to corruption, nepotism, and also other forms of theft. Now, also, since time immemorial, South Africa is a nation with the highest level of inequality, and this is part of what is actually ailing the economy. Now, in order to bridge this gap, South Africa introduced the Black Economic Empowerment to actually enhance the economic participation of the Blacks who lived in South Africa. So basically, this was to ensure that all the people in South Africa fully enjoy the right to equality. How successful it is, we are yet to know, because the gap between the rich and the poor is still very much visible. Now, in order for South Africa to actually thrive, the focus needs to be on creating a business environment more conducive to private investment, and also focus on creating employment opportunities for its citizens. And this means that there should be policies that are geared towards supporting and also empowering the marginalized, that is when it comes to education, health, and the likes. Now, of course, there are plenty of reasons and contributions to Africa's economic state, and it is clear that the colonialism blame game should actually be a thing of the past. So what lessons can we learn from this? Now, lesson number one, which reminded me of an article on Quora that said Africa is not really poor, rather poorly managed, is that African nations need to elect transparent and accountable and also strong leaders who are more focused on actually growing individuals in the country rather than selfishly basking in riches while the people suffer. This means fighting nepotism and corruption, as well as severe measures for leaders who embezzle, who tamper with the country's resources. This also means that government expenditure should be reduced and the money redirected to actually developing the country, just like the developed nations do. Lesson number two that African nations can actually pick, especially from a country like Singapore, is introducing favorable taxation policies, that is for small business owners, and the policies will also attract foreign investments in the country, thus creating employment opportunities. And this will in turn contribute to reducing the poverty of the country. The third lesson is that African nations need to empower individuals, that is in terms of education, training, and also creating employment opportunities, that is for individuals living in both the urban and rural areas. Because at the end of the day, there is no glory in receiving praise for being rich while the common citizen cannot even put food on the table.